The evening sky turned purple as the city lights began to twinkle. Outside Maison Bleu, a line of luxury cars dropped off guests wearing designer clothes and expensive jewelry. The restaurant stood tall with its blue-tinted windows and gold trim, a place where the rich came to be seen. 28-year-old Amara Johnson fixed her black bow tie in the staff bathroom mirror. Her fingers smoothed down her crisp white shirt, and she took a deep breath. 3 years of working at this fancy restaurant had taught her a lot, mostly how to smile through difficult situations. The job paid well enough to cover her graduate school bills, and most nights weren't too bad. "You're on Section 3 tonight," said Miguel, the floor manager, passing by with a stack of menus. "The Harrington party just arrived. Table 12. Amara nodded, her stomach tightening a little. Everyone on staff knew about Victoria Harrington. The woman came from old money, the kind that went back generations. Her family name was on buildings downtown, and her picture often appeared in social magazines at charity events. But among the restaurant staff, she was known for something else entirely. "Be careful with that one," whispered Tanya, another waitress, as she hurried past with a tray of drinks. She made Lai cry last month over the temperature of her soup. Amara squared her shoulders. She needed this job, and she was good at it. With textbooks waiting for her at home and tuition payments due next week, she couldn't afford to lose her position over one difficult customer. The dining room hummed with conversation and the gentle clink of silverware against fine china. Soft piano music played from hidden speakers, and the smell of expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of gourmet food. Amara approached table 12, where 5 well-dressed people sat around Victoria Harrington. Victoria didn't look up when Amara arrived at the table. She was a striking woman in her mid-50s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a face that had clearly benefited from the work of expensive surgeons. Her red dress probably cost more than Amara's monthly rent. "Good evening," Amara said with a warm smile. "Welcome to Maison Bleu. My name is Amara, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. May I start you off with some drinks?" Victoria finally looked up, her eyes scanning Amara from head to toe in a quick, dismissive glance. "We'll have 2 bottles of the 2010 Chateau Margaux," she said without returning the smile. "And don't let them breathe too long like last time." Amara nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Excellent choice. I'll bring those right away." As she walked toward the wine cellar, Amara could hear laughter erupting from the table. Something about the tone made her think they might be laughing at her, but she pushed the thought aside. This was just another shift, just another table of rich people who thought their money made them better than the people serving them. The night progressed smoothly at first. Amara brought the wine, took food orders, and kept everything running without a hitch. Victoria's friends seemed pleasant enough, though they barely acknowledged Amara's presence. But Victoria grew more impatient as the evening wore on, checking her watch repeatedly and sighing loudly. What Amara didn't know was that the kitchen was falling behind. A large party in the private dining room had ordered off-menu items, pulling the head chef away from his regular duties. The delay would soon reach Victoria's table, and Amara would find herself caught in the middle of a situation that would change both their lives forever. As she pushed through the swinging doors into the kitchen to check on her orders, Amara had no idea that in less than an hour, her name and face would be spreading across social media, or that the next time Victoria Harrington raised her hand, the whole world would be watching. Back in the kitchen, chaos reigned. Pots clanged, chefs shouted orders, and servers darted between workstations. Heat blasted from the industrial ovens as Amara approached the head chef, Diego. "How long on table 12's order?" she asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. Diego wiped sweat from his brow with his forearm. "At least 20 more minutes. That private party threw everything off schedule." He gave her a sympathetic look. "Victoria Harrington." Amara nodded. "She's already checking her watch every 2 minutes." "I'll do what I can," Diego promised, turning back to the grill where several steaks sizzled. Taking a deep breath, Amara pushed through the swinging doors back into the dining room. The contrast between the frantic kitchen and the elegant restaurant always gave her whiplash. She approached Victoria's table with a practiced smile. "I wanted to let you know there's a slight delay with your entrees. The kitchen is preparing them with extra care and they'll be out shortly." Victoria's perfectly manicured hand slammed onto the white tablecloth. "Slightly delayed? We've been waiting for 35 minutes. Her voice rose, causing nearby diners to glance over. This is unacceptable. I understand your frustration, Amara said softly. Perhaps I can bring some complimentary appetizers while you wait. One of Victoria's dinner companions, a gray-haired man in an expensive suit, nodded. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it, Victoria? But Victoria wasn't interested in being reasonable. Her face flushed red beneath her makeup. No, it's not reasonable. I made these reservations weeks ago. Do you have any idea who I am? Amara maintained her composure, though her heart raced. Yes, Mrs. Harrington. I'm doing everything I can to expedite your order. Everything you can. Victoria's voice dripped with sarcasm. How hard is it to bring food to a table? Or is that too difficult for someone like you? The table fell uncomfortably silent. The implication in Victoria's words hung in the air. Amara felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. 6 years of customer service had taught her to wear a mask. Your food will be out as soon as possible, she said, turning to leave. 15 minutes later, Amara balanced 5 plates along her arms as she carefully made her way to table 12. The kitchen had finally completed their order, and Diego had made sure everything looked perfect. She set down each dish with precision, describing the food as she served it. And for you, Mrs. Harrington, the filet mignon, medium rare with truffled potatoes and seasonal vegetables. Victoria stared at her steak, then cut into it without a word. Amara watched nervously as Victoria examined the pink center of the meat. This is not medium rare, Victoria declared loudly. This is practically still mooing. Take it back immediately. Amara peered at the steak, which was perfectly medium rare by any culinary standard. I'm sorry it's not to your liking. I'll have the kitchen prepare a new one. Do you think I have all night to wait for you people to get it right? Victoria's voice rose again, drawing more attention. Her dinner companions looked increasingly uncomfortable. Victoria, please, murmured the woman beside her. The steak looks fine to me. Victoria ignored her friend. She stood up suddenly, towering over Amara. I've had enough of this incompetence. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Victoria's hand swung through the air, connecting with Amara's cheek with a crack that silenced the entire restaurant. The force of the slap knocked Amara back a step, her hand automatically rising to her stinging face. Known your place, Victoria hissed, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Then she added a racial slur that gasped through the room like a shockwave. Stunned silence followed. Diners at nearby tables froze with forks midway to their mouths. A waiter dropped a glass somewhere, the crash seemingly thunderous in the quiet. Then came the unmistakable sounds of cell phones being unlocked. At least a dozen people had their cameras pointed at the scene, recording everything. Amara's mind raced through her options. She could run to the back and cry. She could yell. She could even slap Victoria back. But instead, she did something Victoria clearly didn't expect. She stood perfectly still, hand still on her reddening cheek, and looked Victoria directly in the eyes. You just assaulted me, Amara said, her voice steady and clear. And based on the phones I see, at least 15 people just recorded you doing it. Victoria's face flickered with shock, as if she hadn't considered there might be consequences for her actions. For a split second, uncertainty crossed her features, but she quickly recovered. Do you know who my husband is? Victoria hissed, leaning closer. One phone call, and you'll never work in this city again. By now, Miguel, the floor manager, had hurried over. He was a tall man with a perpetually worried expression that had deepened into outright panic. Mrs. Harrington, please, he began, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Let's discuss this privately. But Amara spoke before Victoria could respond. Miguel, this woman just physically assaulted me and used a racial slur. I want the police called immediately. Her voice remained steady, though her cheek still stung and her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The mention of police caused Victoria to step back, blinking rapidly. She looked around at the other diners, many still holding their phones up, and seemed to realize for the first time that she had an audience. This is ridiculous, Victoria said, her voice no longer quite so confident. You're exaggerating. It was barely a tap. "We all saw what happened," said an older woman at a nearby table, her voice firm. "That was assault, plain and simple." "I've already sent the video to my daughter," added another customer. "She's a reporter at Channel 7 News." Victoria's friends looked mortified. The gray-haired man pulled out his wallet and threw several $100 bills on the table. "Victoria, we need to leave. Now." "Yes, please do try to leave," Amara said, surprising herself with her boldness. "The police will be very interested in that." Miguel, caught between protecting his wealthy customer and supporting his employee, hesitated only briefly before turning to the hostess station. "Lena, call the police." Victoria's face drained of color. "You cannot be serious." "Never been more serious in my life," Amara said, finding strength flowing into her with each word. Years of swallowing her feelings, of smiling through insults, of pretending not to notice when customers treated her differently than her white coworkers, it all bubbled to the surface now. "I've worked in restaurants for 10 years, she continued, aware that people were still recording. "I've been called names. I've been given smaller tips. I've been asked if someone else could serve a table. But no one has ever put their hands on me, and no one ever will again." Victoria glanced toward the exit, clearly considering making a run for it. But the restaurant's burly bartender, Raj, had quietly positioned himself near the door, arms folded across his chest. "Mrs. Harrington, perhaps you should sit down and wait for the authorities," he suggested, his tone polite but firm. Victoria's shoulders slumped as she realized she was trapped. Suddenly, she didn't look like the powerful socialite who had entered the restaurant earlier that evening. She looked like what she was, a middle-aged woman who had made a terrible mistake. Her friends exchanged uncomfortable glances. One by one, they gathered their belongings. "We'll wait outside," said the woman who had tried to calm Victoria earlier. "I'm sorry," she added quietly to Amara before hurrying away. The others followed, none making eye contact as they left Victoria alone at the table. Diego emerged from the kitchen, having heard the commotion. He took one look at Amara's face and immediately guided her to a chair. "Are you okay?" he asked, genuine concern in his eyes. "Do you need ice for your cheek?" Amara touched her face, surprised to find tears there. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off, leaving her shaky. "I'm fine," she insisted, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The restaurant had fallen into an awkward hush. Some patrons tried to resume their meals, while others openly stared at Victoria, who sat alone, her face a mask of anger and humiliation. "Your video is already getting shares," whispered Tanya, showing Amara her phone. On the screen, a social media post with the caption, "WATCH, Wealthy Woman Assaults Black Waitress at Maison Bleu," already had hundreds of comments and thousands of views. Amara felt a strange mixture of emotions: vindication, fear, uncertainty. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew there was no going back. The moment Victoria's hand had struck her face, both their lives had changed irrevocably. The police cruiser pulled up outside, lights flashing through the restaurant's front windows. 2 officers entered, their expressions serious as Miguel directed them to the scene. "Is this the woman who assaulted you?" the first officer asked Amara. She nodded, meeting Victoria's gaze directly. "Yes, officer. That's her." The next morning, Amara woke up to her phone buzzing nonstop. She reached for it groggily, squinting at the screen. Dozens of notifications flooded in, messages from friends, calls from numbers she didn't recognize, and social media alerts that made her sit up straight in bed. "Oh my God," she whispered, scrolling through her feeds. The video had exploded overnight, 3 million views and climbing. News websites had picked up the story with headlines like, "Waitress turns up to wealthy patron after assault," and "Restaurant slut goes viral, race and class tensions exposed." Amara's roommate Priya knocked on the door before poking her head in. "You're trending," she said, holding up her own phone. "How are you feeling?" Amara touched her cheek, which still showed a faint red mark. "I don't know." Overwhelmed. She hadn't slept well. After giving her statement to the police, she'd watched as they escorted Victoria out of the restaurant in handcuffs. The image had replayed in her mind all night. This powerful woman who had probably never faced consequences before, being led away while diners recorded the scene. The restaurant called, Pryor said, sitting on the edge of the bed. 3 times already this morning. Amara checked the time, not even 9 a.m. yet. What did they say? They want you to call them back urgently. And there's a reporter from the Tribune downstairs. I told him to go away. Amara groaned, falling back against her pillows. This is insane. All I did was stand up for myself. That's exactly why people are connecting with it, Pryor said gently. How many times have we all wanted to do exactly what you did? The phone rang again. This time it was her mother. Baby, are you okay? I just saw the video. Why didn't you call me last night? Amara tried to sound calmer than she felt. I'm fine, Mom. It happened so fast, and then the police were taking statements until late. I didn't want to worry you. Worry me? My daughter gets assaulted and it's all over the internet. Her mother's voice cracked. Your father and I are coming over. Mom, really, We'll be there in an hour. The tone in her mother's voice made it clear this wasn't negotiable. After hanging up, Amara forced herself to check her email. Among the messages from journalists and strangers was one that made her breath catch. From Torres Nadia. Subject: representing you in the Victoria Harrington case. I'm an attorney with the Civil Rights Coalition, it began. I specialize in cases involving racial discrimination and would like to offer my services pro bono. What happened to you represents a disturbing pattern of behavior that needs to be addressed. Please call me at your earliest convenience. Amara read the email twice, trying to process it. A lawyer wanted to take her case. She hadn't even thought about suing. Her phone buzzed with a text from Miguel. Owners want to meet with you at 2 p.m. They're supportive. Please come. The doorbell rang, and Pryor went to answer it. Amara heard muffled voices, then Pryor returned with a strained expression. There are 3 more reporters outside now. And someone sent flowers. She handed Amara a small bouquet with a card that read, Thank you for standing up. You spoke for all of us. Amara placed the flowers on her nightstand, feeling a strange mix of pride and anxiety. She'd never wanted to be the center of attention like this. She just wanted to be treated with basic respect. Her phone rang again, a number she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. Amara Johnson, this is Thomas Harrington. The deep voice on the other end sent a chill through her. Victoria's husband. I think we need to talk. His tone wasn't threatening, but rather tired and formal. My wife's behavior was inexcusable. I'm calling to personally apologize and to let you know I'm ready to make this right. Amara sat up straighter. Make it right how? Financially. Name your price. We can have this settled by the end of the day. The casual way he offered money, as if throwing cash at the problem would make it disappear, made something harden inside Amara. Mr. Harrington, this isn't about money. Everything's about money, he replied with a humorless laugh. Let's be realistic. 20,000? 50. Let's just make this go away quietly. Amara thought about all the times she'd been made to feel small, all the microaggressions she'd endured while keeping a smile on her face. She thought about how Victoria had talked to her as if she were nothing. I'm sorry, but I'm not interested in settling, she said firmly. And I should let you know I've been contacted by an attorney. There was a long pause on the other end. That would be unwise, Thomas finally said, his voice cooler now. We have resources you can't imagine. So do I, apparently, Amara replied, thinking of the millions of strangers who had watched the video, who had sent flowers and supportive messages. Goodbye, Mr. Harrington. She hung up, her hands shaking slightly but her resolve stronger than ever. Whatever came next, she wouldn't be bullied into silence, not by Victoria, not by Thomas, not by anyone. The doorbell rang again, and this time Amara heard her parents' voices. She took a deep breath and went to greet them, knowing that the fight ahead would require all her strength. 2 weeks after the slap that changed her life, Amara sat at her kitchen table staring at her laptop. Another death threat had arrived in her email inbox. She closed the message with a sigh and rubbed her tired eyes. You shouldn't read those, said Nadia Torres, her attorney, who was reviewing documents across the table. That's why we set up the separate email account for you. I know, Amara admitted, but sometimes I can't help it. I want to understand why people are so angry at me for just standing up for myself. The past 14 days had been a whirlwind. Victoria Harrington had been charged with assault and released on bail the same night of the incident. Her lawyer had arranged a press conference where Victoria read a carefully worded apology that sounded more like it was written by a PR team than coming from her heart. Meanwhile, Thomas Harrington had increased his settlement offers daily. The latest one had reached $250,000, a life-changing amount for a graduate student working as a waitress. But Amara hadn't budged. "Any more photographers outside?" asked Pryor, bringing in 3 mugs of coffee and setting them on the table. "Just one this morning," Amara replied. "I think they're finally getting bored with me." Nadia shuffled through her papers. The restaurant's statement of support was helpful, and your interview yesterday went well. You came across as reasonable and thoughtful. What Nadia didn't mention was the darker side of Amara's sudden fame. Conservative commentators had accused her of playing the race card and seeking attention. Internet trolls had dug up old social media posts and twisted them out of context. Someone had even published her address online, forcing her to temporarily move in with her parents. The Harringtons Foundation lost 3 major donors yesterday, Nadia noted, scrolling through news on her phone. And there's a boycott brewing against Thomas's investment firm. Amara felt a pang of something like guilt. "I never wanted to destroy their lives." "You didn't," Nadia said firmly. "Victoria did this to herself. And based on what my investigator found, this wasn't an isolated incident." That had been the most shocking revelation. 2 former household employees and another restaurant worker had come forward with similar stories about Victoria's treatment. None had involved physical assault, but the pattern of behavior was clear. Amara's phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Check the mail today. Your dad and I sent something to cheer you up." At least her parents had been her rock through all this. Her father had wanted her to take the settlement money, practical as always, but he respected her decision to pursue the case. Her mother had simply held her when the stress became overwhelming, not needing words. "I have to get to campus," Amara said, gathering her textbooks. She had missed a week of classes but was determined not to fall behind. Her professors had been understanding, offering extensions on assignments. "Don't forget your pepper spray," Pryor reminded her. The threatening emails had made them all more cautious. "And remember," Nadia added, "no talking to reporters without calling me first." Outside, the late autumn air felt crisp and clean. Amara pulled her coat tighter and started walking toward the bus stop. A car slowed beside her, making her heart rate spike, but it was just someone looking for a parking space. She was always on edge now. The confident woman who had stood up to Victoria in the restaurant sometimes felt like a different person entirely. That Amara had acted on instinct, without thinking about the consequences. This Amara jumped at sounds and checked over her shoulder constantly. On campus, she felt the stares as she walked to class. Most were supportive. Several students had even formed a social media group called Team Amara. But the attention still made her uncomfortable. Her phone buzzed again. Another email from someone she didn't know. She almost deleted it without reading, assuming it was more hate mail, but the subject line caught her eye. "I used to work for the Harringtons." She opened it, stopping in the middle of the walkway. "Ms. Johnson, you don't know me, but I was Victoria Harrington's personal assistant for 3 years. What happened to you happened to others, myself included. Many of us were too afraid to speak up because of non-disclosure agreements and fear of retaliation. If you're willing to talk, I have information that could help your case." Amara's hands trembled slightly as she forwarded the email to Nadia. This could change everything. As she entered the classroom, her professor gave her a supportive nod. She took her usual seat, trying to focus on normal life, on her education and future career. But her mind kept returning to the weight of what she had taken on. That evening, when she returned to her parents' house, her father was waiting on the porch. "There's a package for you," he said, his expression unreadable. "From Victoria Harrington." Amara froze. "You didn't open it, did you?" "Of course not. Called Nadia first. She said not to touch it, just in case." They'd both stared at the small box sitting on the kitchen counter. What could Victoria possibly want to send her? An apology? A threat? Amara's phone rang. Nadia again. "I just got off the phone with 3 more former Harrington employees," the lawyer said, her voice charged with excitement. "Amara, we're not just fighting for you anymore. This case could change how powerful people think they can treat others." For the first time in days, Amara felt a genuine smile spread across her face. Whatever was in that package, whatever challenges still lay ahead, she knew she had made the right choice by refusing to back down. 6 months after that fateful night at Maison Bleue, Amara sat in the hallway outside courtroom 12B. Her hands were tightly folded in her lap as she tried to control her breathing. The polished marble floors and wood-paneled walls of the courthouse felt imposing and cold. "You okay?" asked Nadia, looking up from her notes. The attorney had become not just Amara's legal counsel, but her friend over the past months. Amara nodded, though her stomach was in knots, just ready for this to be over. Today was the first day of the civil trial. The criminal case had been settled 2 months earlier, with Victoria pleading guilty to a lesser charge of misdemeanor assault. She'd received a fine and community service, a slap on the wrist in Amara's opinion, but that was how the system worked for wealthy people. This case was different. This was Amara's chance to tell her story, to seek justice not just for herself, but for all the others who had come forward. "Remember," Nadia said, squeezing her hand, "just tell the truth. Don't let their lawyer rattle you." The Harringtons had hired Bradley Winston, one of the most expensive attorneys in the state. He had a reputation for aggressive cross-examinations and destroying witnesses' credibility. "What if I freeze up there?" Amara whispered. Despite her months of preparation, she still feared facing Victoria in the courtroom. "You won't," Nadia assured her. "You're the strongest person I know." The courtroom doors opened and a bailiff appeared. "They're ready for you." Inside, the room was smaller than Amara had expected from TV shows. The judge's bench loomed at the front, with the witness stand to the right. The jury box held 12 people of various ages and backgrounds, all watching her intently as she walked in. And there, at the defense table, sat Victoria Harrington. She looked thinner than Amara remembered, her designer outfit more subdued than her usual flashy style. Their eyes met briefly before Victoria looked away. The morning passed in a blur of opening statements. Nadia laid out a compelling narrative of privilege and abuse, backed by testimony from former employees who would speak later in the trial. Winston countered with a story of a momentary lapse in judgment, a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. After lunch, Amara was called to the stand. She swore to tell the truth, her voice steadier than she felt. "Ms. Johnson," Nadia began gently, "could you please tell the court about the night of October 15th? Amara took a deep breath and started to speak. She described her shift, the delayed food, Victoria's growing anger. When she reached the moment of the slap, her voice wavered slightly. "It wasn't just the physical pain," she explained. "It was the shock of being treated like I wasn't even human. And then the slur she used, it made it clear why she thought she could treat me that way." From the corner of her eye, Amara noticed Victoria shift uncomfortably in her seat. "Good." When it was Winston's turn for cross-examination, he approached with a predatory smile. "Ms. Johnson, would you say you were having a difficult night before my client arrived?" "The restaurant was busy, but that's normal," Amara replied carefully. "Isn't it true that you had already received complaints from other tables about slow service?" Amara kept her composure. "No, that's not true." Winston looked surprised, as if expecting her to be rattled. He changed tactics. "You've become something of a celebrity since this incident, haven't you? Appearances on talk shows, a GoFundMe that raised over $100,000, offers for book deals." "Objection," Nadia called. "Relevance?" "Overruled," said the judge. "The witness may answer." Amara met Winston's gaze directly. "I didn't ask for any of that attention. I just wanted to be treated with basic human dignity." For the next hour, Winston tried to chip away at her credibility. He brought up old social media posts, suggested she had provoked Victoria, and implied she was exploiting the situation for financial gain. But Amara held firm, answering truthfully and calmly. "No further questions," Winston finally said, returning to his seat with a frustrated expression. As Amara stepped down from the witness stand, she felt lighter somehow. She had faced her worst fears, being publicly questioned, having her character attacked, and she had survived. What happened next stunned everyone in the courtroom. Victoria Harrington suddenly stood up. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Her lawyer grabbed her arm, whispering urgently, but she shook him off. The judge frowned. "Mrs. Harrington, you're represented by counsel. If you wish to testify, that will come later." "I don't want to testify," Victoria said, her voice breaking slightly. "I want to tell the truth right now." A murmur ran through the courtroom. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed, but understand anything you say can be used in these proceedings." Victoria turned to face Amara directly. "What I did to you was inexcusable. There's no justification, no explanation that makes it okay." Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the redness in her eyes. "The things I said, the way I acted. I've been hiding behind my lawyers and PR team instead of taking real responsibility." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the court reporter paused, fingers hovering over her machine. "I am guilty," Victoria continued, "not just of assault, but of thinking my money and status meant I could treat people however I wanted. I've been that way for years, and no one ever stood up to me until you." 3 years later, Amara stood at the podium, adjusting the microphone. The conference room was packed with people, their faces expectant as they waited for her to speak. Behind her, a large screen displayed the logo of the Harrington Johnson Foundation for Workplace Dignity. "When I walked into work that night," she began, "I had no idea my life was about to change forever. I was just a waitress trying to pay for grad school." The audience listened intently. Many of them knew her story. It had been covered extensively in the media, turned into a documentary, and referenced in countless articles about privilege and accountability. But hearing it from Amara herself still carried a special power. She glanced to her right, where Victoria Harrington sat quietly. The older woman looked different now, her designer clothes replaced by a more modest outfit, her once perfect blonde hair showing strands of natural gray. The arrogance that had once defined her was gone. "The moment Victoria slapped me," Amara continued, 2 paths opened up. One led to more anger, resentment, and division. The other was harder to see at first, but it led to understanding, growth, and ultimately healing. The civil trial had ended with a surprising turn. After Victoria's unexpected courtroom confession, the jury had awarded Amara a substantial settlement. But what happened afterward was even more unexpected. 1 month after the trial ended, Amara had received a handwritten letter from Victoria asking to meet in person. No lawyers, no publicity. Against the advice of almost everyone she knew, Amara had agreed. They'd met at a small coffee shop outside the city. Victoria had arrived alone, looking nervous and out of place without her usual entourage. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Victoria had said after they'd sat in awkward silence for several minutes. "The community service I was assigned, working at a homeless shelter, it opened my eyes to things I've been privileged enough to ignore my whole life." Amara had listened skeptically as Victoria described her awakening. It had sounded like the typical temporary guilt of a rich person confronted with others' suffering. "I know you have no reason to believe me," Victoria had continued, seeming to read Amara's thoughts. "And I'm not asking for forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. But I want to use my resources to make actual change, and I need your help to do it right." That conversation had been the first of many. Gradually, a tentative partnership formed between the most unlikely of allies. Victoria had wealth and connections. Amara had perspective and knowledge. Together, they created something neither could have achieved alone. "Our foundation has now trained over 5,000 service industry workers on their rights," Amara told the audience, "and educated 3,000 employers on creating respectful workplaces. Our scholarship program has helped 100 students from underrepresented backgrounds pursue higher education." She paused, looking out at the faces before her. "But numbers don't tell the whole story. The real impact happens in individual lives, like Dian, who was able to sue his former employer for discrimination, and Win, or Lucia, who completed her nursing degree while supporting 3 children. Victoria rose and joined Amara at the podium. There was still a visible awkwardness between them. They weren't friends in the traditional sense, but something more complex. "I spent most of my life thinking my money made me better than others," Victoria said, her voice softer than it had been that night at the restaurant. "I treated people like Amara as if they existed to serve me. It took losing everything I thought was important, my social standing, many of my friends, even my marriage, to realize how wrong I was. Thomas had filed for divorce shortly after the trial, unable to accept his wife's public transformation from socialite to social justice advocate. The Harrington name had been tarnished in their elite circles, but Victoria had discovered she cared less about that than she'd expected. "We're not here to tell a fairy tale about perfect redemption," Amara said. "Victoria and I still have difficult moments. I haven't forgotten what happened, but we've chosen to channel our experience into something constructive." As the presentation ended and people approached to ask questions, a young waitress came up to Amara. "I've been following your story since it happened," she said shyly. "You made me feel like I matter, like it's okay to expect respect no matter where I work." Amara smiled, remembering her younger self, the waitress who had stood her ground when a wealthy woman thought she could be mistreated without consequences. "You do matter," she told the young woman. "Never let anyone make you feel otherwise." Later, as they'd left the venue, Victoria touched Amara's arm lightly. "Do you ever regret not taking the settlement money and just walking away from all this?" Amara considered the question. Her life would certainly have been easier if she'd taken Thomas's initial offer and disappeared from public view. She wouldn't have had to deal with the death threats, the scrutiny, the exhausting work of building something from scratch. "No," she said finally. "Some things are worth fighting for even when it's hard." As they walked to their separate cars, the unlikely partners in a foundation born from conflict, Amara reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. One moment of standing up for herself had created ripples that continued to spread, changing not just her life, but countless others.